Lesson 3: Feedback Loops in Systems. In this lesson, we will talk about 3 important topics about feedback loops. The first is about the importance of feedback in systems, why feedback is important. Second, we need to understand how we can see feedback loops in systems. How do we identify them? And third, how do we model feedback loops using what we call a causal loop diagram when we try to understand behaviors in our systems. When trying to understand behaviors of systems, we now try to understand a fundamental concept, and that concept is called feedback. Feedback is a very key element of understanding how systems behave. So what is feedback? Feedback is a simple way of taking note of what happens when an action is done, understanding the effect of that action, and what the effect would mean to our next action. Feedback occurs when outputs of a system are routed back as inputs as part of a chain of cause and effect that eventually forms what we call a loop. The system now is said to have a feedback into itself. Why is feedback important in any system? Number 1, the system will have the ability to adapt, adjust, correct, and eventually change itself so that it can achieve the purpose that it has. Without a feedback mechanism, a system is disconnected. They are unconnected and are unable to act accordingly, and therefore will fail in achieving the purpose that it has for itself. Unfortunately, trying to understand feedback is by itself a challenge. Our simple reasoning of cause and effect would not be enough, and it would be difficult to comprehend how one influences the other and eventually goes back to itself. Some people call this some sort of a way to capture karma, or to be able to understand how one action eventually leads back to itself. Essentially, when we try to understand feedback, we want to understand the reasoning behind the cause and effect and how it can eventually lead back to a dynamic relationship where the feedback would create another set of cycle, and eventually the system would be able to adapt or achieve some level of equilibrium. When we try to understand systems, we need to train our eyes and our minds when we try to now identify feedback loops in systems. Recall the dynamic behavior of a system that we first discussed early on in the previous lesson. A system would demonstrate a behavior wherein it is influenced by a series of action, consequences, and information, and leading into a series of adjustments where we call the system being a dynamic system. And because of this dynamic behavior, we now connect or associate this behavior to a feedback mechanism. When we now try to capture feedback, we now identify what we call a feedback loop. A feedback loop is part of a system in which a portion or all of the output of a system goes back as an input for its future operations or decision. when we talk about a feedback mechanism, we can use a simple system diagram that captures a loop from the time an action is done and the corresponding effect of the action that is being handled by a controller and eventually pushes back as an input to the system. Feedback loops, as they will now be implied, can either be negative or positive. There are two types of feedback loops. The first is what we call a positive feedback loop, and the second one is what we call a negative feedback loop. A positive feedback loop can also be referred to as a reinforcing loop. It is typically referred to as a vicious cycle, which can lead to what we call a spiral down of a never-ending result, or a virtuous cycle, which is a positive way of saying things are getting better and better. Eventually, when we talk about positive feedback loops, we are referring to what we call a growth-generating mechanism within your system. A negative feedback loop, on the other hand, refers to what we call a goal-seeking feedback or a balancing loop. This means that an action is directed towards an object in a system where a target is desired and would lead to an eventual stabilization or equilibrium of the system's behavior. Positive feedback loops are those that simply repeat actions that have been effective in the past and eventually acts as a reinforcing agent to continuously promote the same action, leading to better and better results. The intention of a positive feedback loop is to amplify or increase the desired variable or value that is naturally helping the system move up towards its desired state. A problem can occur when a positive feedback loop can grow eventually out of control, because normally positive feedback loops have no check or balances. In such a scenario, a runaway positive feedback loop can make a system become unstable. An example would be looking at protests. When protests are unregulated, it can eventually lead to, or if protests are undressed, it can lead to a worst case situation like riots. And riots can spiral down until you control them. So positive feedback loops are great, but they can backfire in a system. An example of a positive feedback loop is what we call a piano practice loop. Imagine that you're going to play a piano and you want to be better. When we now try to describe this kind of a behavior, we start by looking at the loop in front of us and focus on the amount of practice that you put in. The more practice you have, the better your ability to play. The better your ability to play, the more you enjoy it, and the more you enjoy it, the more you would be happy to practice the piano. When we now try to read the positive feedback loop on playing piano, we now realize that as we keep on practicing, we become better. The more we become better, the more we enjoy it, and the more we will enjoy it, the more I practice it. You get to see now a constantly increasing value or result out of this initiative or effort that you have in getting better. So when we now try to describe our feedback loop in a piano practice, we start by looking at the series of variables, starting with the amount of time you practice, your ability to play, and the level of enjoyment you have. And when you now have more practice, it will now create a higher ability to play, or it will influence your ability to play. So we now have a positive relationship. As you increase your ability to play, your amount of enjoyment also increases. And as your amount of enjoyment increases, your desire or the time you spent playing the piano eventually is being influenced or will also increase. So this in turn creates what we call a positive feedback loop, as denoted by a snowball effect. When we have a snowball rolling down the hill, it accumulates and accumulates until it becomes a big snowball. Equivalently, if you look at the diagram on the right, this kind of a behavior is reflected in a pattern where the value of your variable will constantly increase and could eventually lead to an exponential growth. A negative feedback loop, on the other hand, is often referred to as a self-regulating feedback loop. It tries to maintain an optimal state within a specific boundary. A good example of a feedback loop would be the thermostat that we have in our air conditioning systems, where the thermostat would control the level of temperature or the amount of coolant or the temperature that the air conditioning system would eventually perform to achieve. The moment the system, or in this case the AC, achieves that level, the thermostat triggers the AC to hold that temperature or to stop operating until such temperature is now brought down to the level that it's no longer at its goal, which would now trigger your aircon to start again. Negative feedback loops are known for being stable, but not specially accurate. There will be known delays. For example, when we talk about having to have adjusting the temperature of the room, there will always be delays for an aircon to respond. So, depending on the nature of your system, feedback loops such as negative feedback loops are a component that would help your system achieve its goal. Let's take the case of a negative feedback loop using what we call a tired sleep loop. In this example, we're now going to describe the relationship of how we now deal with being tired and sleeping. Let us begin by starting with how tired we are. The more tired we are, the more you sleep, the more I sleep, and the more you sleep, the less tired you become. Or supposedly, you should be able to recover your energy. And the less tired you have, the less you will not sleep because you have more energy. And the less you sleep, eventually, you get tired again. And you get more tired again. So notice the pattern by which the level by which our tiredness goes up and down over time. So by characterizing what we call a tired sleep loop, we start by focusing on how tired we are, and the more tired we are, the more sleep we would have, or the more sleep we would need. And the more sleep we have, or the more sleep we would eventually have or need, eventually you would have less tired of a feeling. So you now have what we call a positive and a negative relationship. A positive is where as the tiredness level increases, the sleep level is also increasing. And as the sleep level increases, eventually the tired level decreases. Such is the meaning of a negative relationship. This will now give you what we call a negative feedback loop, as described by the symbol of a seesaw, where the seesaw acts as a balance that is built into the system. And consequently, you can now look at the pattern of behavior that is generated equivalent to this system that we have for our tired sleep loop, where the tired level goes up and down until you get to have a more stable level of energy and sleep. These two feedback loops form the fundamental understanding of what feedback loops are in our systems. We talked about a positive feedback loop, where a change in a variable A causes a change in a variable B, which in turn causes a change in A in the same direction. So that means that the degree by which the infected people increases would also increase the values. For example, in our situation right now in the pandemic, the more infected people we have, the more virus there are in our system overall. And the more virus there are, the more people will be infected. And this forms what we call a fundamental positive feedback loop. And therefore, the more and more number of people will be infected over time. While a negative feedback loop is a change in a variable A causes a change in B, which in turn causes a change in A. But the change can be opposite in direction. Recall the example of wolves changing the river, where you have two animals, which is often described as a predator-prey model, where the wolf, as the wolf population increases, then there is less elk, or in this case, the deer. And when there's less deer, then there's going to be less wolf eventually, because since there's less prey, then the wolf would eventually go down. But when the wolf goes down, eventually the elk population will go up. And then this cycle continues. So you now have what we call an oscillating pattern, as we have learned in our previous lesson. So negative feedback loops creates what we call oscillating patterns, while positive feedback loops create exponential or growth patterns. Whenever we represent a feedback loop, keep in mind that we are describing the relationship of one variable, which is called the influencing variable, to an influence variable, or to the other variable that's going to be affected or influenced. And that the arrow directs the direction of influence, who influences whom, and the relationship is described by the sign. A positive relationship means that both variables, the influencing and the influence, go up or go down. So when they go both in the same direction, the relationship is a positive relationship. When the two variables are opposite in relationship, that as one goes up, the other goes down, or when the other goes down or goes up, then we talk about a negative relationship. When identifying the feedback loop, we now look at the signs that are present within the loop. So a negative feedback loop is one that contains an odd number of negative links. Think of it as multiplying negative numbers. If the product of the signs turn out to be negative, then it's a negative feedback loop. If the product of the signs will lead to a positive answer, then it's a positive feedback loop. Once we have identified that, we now define it as both a negative or a positive loop, or if you look at Peter Sengi's notation, a negative feedback loop can be defined or denoted as a seesaw, and a positive feedback loop can be denoted as a snowball effect. Let's apply the idea of the feedback loop into another example. In this example, we talk about depression, which is something quite common in many young people or even adults. A simplified way of representing depression could be as simple as, the degree of depression and the amount of crying that you have. So the degree of depression, if higher, means that, you cry more. And the more you cry can lead to a more depressed state. So in this situation, we now talk about this as a positive feedback loop. Hence, the more I cry, the more depressed I feel. The more depressed I feel, the more I cry. And as you keep on looking at this pattern, this is a very good example of a vicious cycle where one leads to more and more levels of depression. In order to better understand the simplified loop, we can actually disaggregate the loop and introduce more variables so that people or other persons or stakeholders can better understand the nature of the loop. So in this case, we have disaggregated our other variables just by not focusing on depression and crying, but add other variables that is a factor in our system in this situation, or a depression system. So we talk about the degree of depression influencing the amount of crying. The more you cry, the more your eyes are red. The more your eyes are red, the more you try to hide it. Maybe you wear dark glasses. And the more you keep on wearing dark glasses, the more people are asking, why are you wearing dark glasses? And the more people pay attention to you and ask you embarrassing questions, the more you're depressed. By looking at this entire cycle, you now have a better understanding of the simplified loop and still maintain the positive feedback loop that exists in our system. Another example is what we call a desert and weight gain loop. In this loop, we talk about three basic variables in trying to control my personal weight. So we talk about how much dessert I eat, my current weight, how I'm as overweight or how heavy I am, and then my concern about my weight. So allow me to start by focusing on my concern about weight. The more I'm more concerned about my weight, the less desserts I eat because I'm more conscious. And the less dessert I eat, your amount of overweight goes down because that means that you're not eating more desserts as always. When your amount of weight or overweight goes down, then your concern about your weight also goes down. However, when your concern about the weight goes down, then it triggers now a desire to eat more dessert, since anyway, my concern is less, I'm not as concerned as before, and therefore I tend to eat more dessert. And when I eat more dessert, then I gain more weight or more pounds. And when I gain more weight, then again, it leads to a positive relationship that I'm now concerned again about my weight. So looking at this cycle leads to what we call now a negative feedback loop of why weight gain sometimes is quite a challenge, because it is a negative feedback loop in its core. What we want to do right now is to be able to bring in how we can use these concepts of feedback loops into a more serious way of defining our systems. We now create what we call causal loops, where systems can actually contain more than one feedback loops. What are causal loops then? Causal loops are one of the basic tools in systems thinking, where we try to understand the basic structure that happens in the system. Systems, as we talked about before, are abstract characterizations of how things are formed, and that these systems are made up of components. And how we would now describe this system is to approach it using what we call a causal loop diagram. A causal loop diagram is also referred to as an influence diagram, or in a more mathematical term, a directed graph. That means there are arrows. The diagram shows the causal link among actions, information, and consequences. A positive link means that the value of one variable increases the other variable, while a negative link means that as one variable increases, the other goes down. Looking at the example on the right, we have two causal loop diagrams. The tired sleep model we had before is now expanded into a more complicated, slightly complicated diagram where you now have two interlacing negative feedback loops. So something more tricky. So the amount of sleep you have means that you are less tired. The less tired you have, then the less sleep you have. And then eventually it goes back to a negative feedback loop. However, being less tired means that, okay, I can now do more activity. And the more activities I do, eventually I get tired. So you now have two balancing loops that makes the tired sleep activity system a bit more complicated to understand. A more business-like example is when we apply TQM activities and training. We have TQM trainings, and the more we do TQM trainings, the more there are TQM activities. So instead of using plus or minus, we now use S or O. The S symbol represents the same, or that's the positive, and the O represents the opposite, or the negative. So as more TQM training is done, more TQM activities, the more trainings are done. However, as more TQM activities are done, there can be a perceived threat, and the threat can lead to more resistance by middle managers, and the threat or the resistance can lead to less TQM activities. So in this example of the causal loop diagram, we can have two kinds of loops. The TQM training and the TQM activities is a positive feedback loop, while the TQM to the perceived threat and the resistance to manager is a negative feedback loop. So causal loop diagrams are a very simple way of transforming or converting our understanding of the system into a simple diagram. It is a very good tool for communicating to our various stakeholders, and it does not require a very deep understanding of simulation. A good example that we can use to describe the idea of market saturation in word of mouth is using a basic causal loop diagram here, where we can start with the number of adopters, and that the more adopters we have, the more adoption rate we can have, because we can use them to spread the word. And the more adoption rate we have, meaning more people are talking about it, the more adopters we have. So it's a reinforcing loop. However, the adoption rate can lead to less potential adopters, meaning that since you have more and more people now converting to adopters, there's going to be less potential adopters left. And when there's less potential adopters, this would lead to a lower adoption rate. And then a lower adoption rate would mean also less adopters. So by having these two negative and positive feedback loops that are constantly struggling in the system, the question now is which loop will be more dominant moving forward. When building your causal loop diagram, we have some guidelines for us to follow. For one, always keep your diagrams simple to begin with. Don't attempt to build a huge diagram. Focus on the basic. An example will be hunger and food consumption. The more hunger we have, the more we consume food, right? The more you consume food, the less hunger you have. Use the nouns or noun phrases. Don't put action words or verbs. Always try to use a verb that's positive, okay? Meaning that it's the positive word of something. So, for example, instead of saying hunger, you might say malnutrition or say lack of nutrition. So that is a negative word to use. Always use a positive word that can easily be interpreted later on. Do not use the loop to mean and then. Now, the loop is not a sequence of events, but rather how variables influence the other variable. So when you try to describe your causal loop diagram, always refer to the variables as something that's going to be increasing or decreasing, meaning they are quantities that can go up, or they can go down. So when we try to diagram our causal loop, we don't have to worry about whether they can be quantified right now or not. What is more important is that you look at them as something that you can imagine that it can grow in terms of a quantity, rise or fall, or decline, or go up and down. So the goal here is to be able to understand the relationship of the so-called variables. So in this example, we talk about people buying products. And the more people buy products, your install base goes up. As your install base goes up, potential customers are told, meaning they're being, other people are convinced. And when people are convinced, they buy more product. So that's a typical reinforcing loop. So that's why it's an R. And then from a buying your product, when people buy your product, potential customers are less, and therefore less people are buying. So this is another example of the market adoption we talked about in the previous slide. When building your causal loop diagram, try to identify the unit of your variables. Think of it as a way, an exercise to train your mind to try to measure or provide the measure of your variable. If necessary, invent one like degree or level or some sort of a rank or whatever it is that you can imagine to be a quantity. If a link needs explanation, consider disaggregating it. Make it a series of links. For example, we talk about price and revenue. When price increases, does revenue increase? One way to elaborate more about it is that, when price increase, revenue can increase, but it is not the only link. When price increase, it means that sales can go down because it's more expensive. But as sales increase, or when sales decrease, revenue also decreases. So there are two arrows driving revenues. It's not a single arrow only. Although price can influence revenue, price can also influence revenue in a negative way. When we have this example here, take note that we do not yet have a closed loop. So it's not yet a feedback loop. Although it might appear that we've created a circle, looking at the arrows do not go back to where it started. So this is not a closed loop yet. It's not yet a feedback loop. Watch out for unintended effects. Price drives revenue positively because the higher the price, obviously the higher the value, but price can also bring down revenue. The last important ideas when you build your causal loop diagram is to be able to clearly identify the variable that you're using, whether you're referring to an actual value or a perceived value. When using a variable, an actual value refers to an actual result, and oftentimes there would be a corresponding desired value. A desired value is something that you try to aim for. For example, let's look at the first illustration on our left, where we talk about product quality and improvement. As product quality increases, there's less desire to have an improvement program, and the improvement programs, as more improvement programs, the better the quality. If you look at this one, it's a bit like it's oversimplified. It doesn't mean that the more improvement programs you have, you have more product qualities. In fact, there's this belief that when you have more improvement programs, it is a reflection of your lack of confidence that your products are actually great products. So a better way to capture improvement programs is to be able to measure the reason why you have improvement programs. And it's not about product quality, but the shortfall between your product quality and a desired quality. And because of that shortfall is the reason why you have improvement programs, not because of your product quality by itself. So whenever you build causal loop diagrams, think about the purpose of the model. What is it trying to say? Oftentimes when we build models, we need to keep in mind whether we're building the model from a strategic perspective of the business, or are we talking about it from an operations level or even at a tactical level of the system. Some key questions to ask ourselves when we're building our causal loop model for our systems. What's the purpose of the system? What are we trying to represent? Who will be the audience of the diagram later on? Would there be executives? Would there be operations people? Would there be external people? Are the variables that you choose consistent with the purpose of what you're trying to demonstrate or the purpose of the system. You don't show the board of directors a causal loop diagram that is very operational in nature. Consequently, you also don't use a high-level strategic diagram of the system to operations people only. So there has to be a balance between the audience and what you use to represent the variables in your system. Are the variables capable of being easily explained to the audience? Oftentimes, a good test would be, could you explain it? If you have a hard time explaining it, most likely the diagram is not a good diagram to use. Are the variables in principle capable of being measured? Can they vary over time? Or maybe they're not, they're relatively constant. In that case, they may not be the right variable at all. Can the diagram be drawn on the level lower or higher without losing the consistency, meaning the clarity of the signs? You don't want to clutter your diagram with too many variables and too many signs. At the end of it all, what you want is a straightforward representation of the links, not because it's too fancy or too complicated that it loses its value to your audience. Some more questions to think about. Is the diagram too complicated that it fails to communicate or confuses your audience? What we want is the diagram should be neat and tidy with as less number of lines crossing the variables. You don't want to have crisscross arrows. Can the feedback loops be seen? Can we actually spot the actual feedback loops, or are they hidden? Do I understand the diagram before I try to explain it to someone else or write about it? The biggest test is to be able to explain it to yourself without grappling for words. And finally, does it capture the most important insights? Are there any careful analysis drawn out of it that would give insights to what we can do about the diagram in this situation? At the end, one of the main reasons why we do a causal loop diagram is that we wanted to be able to apply a systems thinking perspective on how we can understand the system and come up with better policies, better ways to manage the system that will be robust against a range of circumstances. We want to make sure that we have captured or represented the right environmental variables that can affect or create a setback on the system behavior. We also want to make sure that later on, we're able to draw out the right policies that would influence the right behavior of the system. Some important ideas out of lesson 3. A feedback loop is essential for any system to be able to adapt and adjust to changes so that it can achieve its inherent goal. There are two types of feedback loops that we can use as the basic cornerstone of any diagram. These are the negative feedback loops that attempt to adjust and a positive feedback loop that acts as a growth generating mechanism. And finally, a causal loop diagram is a way to represent the feedback loops that drive the behavior of your system. Causal loops can contain more than one feedback loops, which can explain the behavior of your system.